Welcome back to this next lesson in the Drainage Water Quality Monitoring Overview module. This lesson will work toward being able to identify appropriate drainage study designs by first looking at the 4 aspects that typically guide us in designing our monitoring systems. The first aspect to really explicitly define as you start to plan your edge-of-field monitoring work is your research question and your monitoring objectives. Take trouble to be explicit and specific about the type of data amount, and data quality you need to achieve your objectives. Specifically defining the type of data you want to collect includes knowing what analytes you're interested in. For example, for these drainage research plots, the objective was to determine whether split nitrogen application reduced nitrate leaching compared with pre-plant nitrogen applications. So we knew we were specifically interested only in nitrate, not total nitrogen or ammonium, and that helps set a boundary for our monitoring design. Also consider how much data you need to collect to successfully answer your research question. How many sites do you need? Does your monitoring system need to be working for just a couple storm events or for multiple years? In the saturated buffer example, our research objective was to assess the effectiveness of saturated buffers in Illinois. So we wanted as many sites as possible, and we ended up with 3. Lastly, it's important to clearly define the desired quality of your data. Are you monitoring to provide a farmer decision-making information for a specific field in a specific year? Are you collecting data that you intend to eventually publish in a peer-reviewed journal? That required data quality impacts how you design the monitoring system. One side step here in terms of monitoring objective is if you are working for or with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS. The NRCS has specific guidance on edge-of-field monitoring. Conservation Evaluation and Monitoring Activity 201 is for data collection and evaluation, and Conservation Evaluation and Monitoring Activity 202 is for system installation. My point is that you'll notice the objectives defined right at the top of these documents: evaluating the effectiveness of a practice in reducing concentrations and/or loads, and also collecting site-specific edge-of-field water quality data for use in modeling. You start by thinking about what you want to do, that is, what your monitoring objectives are, in a totally ideal world. And then these next 3 factors bring you back down to reality, starting with cost or your available budget. There are a couple of great quotes from an article that is a suggestive reading. Most projects designed to collect discharge or flow and water quality data are constrained by limited resources. And the success of monitoring projects is often determined by the trade-off between the resources available and accurate characterization of the water quality. We all want our projects to be successful, but we deal with limited funding. And so you prioritize by thinking through your budget. There's usually 5 main types of costs to think about: initial equipment costs and site establishment, maintenance of your equipment, and then personnel, travel, and sample analysis costs. There's the upfront cost of buying and installing your monitoring system, which is often sizable, but you absolutely cannot forget about ongoing maintenance costs, especially if you're going to monitor for several years. And in terms of equipment maintenance, paying for preventative maintenance is worth its weight in gold. There will be rodent damage. And don't forget, you may want to have duplicate or backup equipment for those most critical pieces that you often use. So that just doubled your cost. Lastly, the fact that research funding cycles tend to allow 3 or 4-year grants is complicated for long-term studies, but that just needs to be planned for if long-term monitoring is a part of your objective. Moving on to labor and personnel considerations, I have found this to be the most critical aspect for project success. And we'll go back to our friend Dr. Harmel for a couple quotes. Committed on-call field staff are essential for our projects to be successful. Field personnel should be well trained on the quality control methods, on equipment, on basic hydrology, and of course on safety. If your team isn't well trained or doesn't fully understand the objectives, you will miss data collection that simply cannot be recreated. You cannot cross the same river twice. There is no way to go backwards in time for this type of monitoring to collect data that has been missed. You may want to start by thinking about who will do what in terms of the entire workflow from the field to the lab. And then make sure everyone on the team understands and agrees with their role. Field personnel need to be flexible, particularly during periods of high flow, which for us with drainage tends to be late winter or spring through to early summer. I mentioned the workflow from the field to the lab. And so when planning edge of field monitoring studies, it's also important to think about your lab personnel and lab capacity, especially if you're processing and analyzing samples in-house. Sampling expectations should be reasonable based on what the lab can handle. The final, but equally important consideration when designing an edge of field monitoring system has to do with the site itself. Sometimes you're presented with a location, and other times you may have a choice. Taking one more note from Dr. Harmel, the number and location of sampling sites directly affects your budget and your personnel. You ideally want to select sites based on proximity and travel time. Because remember, for water studies, you have to make the most trips when it's wet. There are pros and cons for doing your research on a private farm or using a university research farm if one is available. This may also come back to your objectives. Do you need small replicated plots? Or is it important for your project for you to connect directly with growers by monitoring their tile outlets? You also want to consider what amenities are available. Do you need electricity? Do you need internet signal for your data loggers? That has been an issue for us. Do you need a porta potty? That has also been an issue for us. Accessibility and safety cannot be understated. We have some sampling locations that are half a mile back from the road and are pretty remote. You can imagine a serious injury back there would not be good, especially if you weren't traveling in pairs. There's a trade-off, though, with location when thinking about vandalism. We might not want to put your equipment in a highly visible location right next to a road. So always consider safety as well as vandalism. There's a lot to think about as we start to plan our monitoring studies. See you next time.